every war ends. The only question is how, and at what cost. After 3 years of devastating losses, 2025 feels like a turning point in Ukraine's war with Russia. This video will cut through speculation by examining 3 critical fronts: the current battlefield reality, the state of diplomacy, and the scenarios for how resolution might actually unfold. With millions displaced and Europe still absorbing large refugee flows, pressure is mounting on leaders who cannot ignore the cost any longer. But before any political breakthroughs can take shape, we need to look at what is happening on the ground itself. The war's battlefield in 2025. In early 2025, the battlefield in Ukraine remains strikingly unchanged from the end of 2023. Despite months of fighting, the front lines have shifted little. Cities that were bitterly contested 18 months ago remain contested today, while entrenched defensive belts continue to define southern and eastern Ukraine. What this shows most clearly is that the war has entered a phase defined less by maneuver and more by endurance. Neither side has managed the kind of decisive breakthrough once promised, and the conflict has become a test of resources, adaptation, and sheer willpower. Russia continues to hold roughly 1/5 of Ukraine's territory, according to multiple assessments. This includes large portions of the Donbass, and crucially, the corridor linking mainland Russia to Crimea. On paper, that control may look like a strong position, but the Russian military of 2025 is not the same force that launched the full-scale invasion. Losses in armored vehicles, missiles, trained personnel, and basic logistics have been enormous. Independent analyses highlight extensive equipment attrition, and with production capacity strained, Moscow has shifted from aggressive advances to reinforcing what it already holds. Its ability to mount large-scale offensives has eroded, and limited local gains often come at disproportionate cost. Ukraine has responded by reshaping its battlefield strategy. It no longer attempts to claw back every patch of territory through costly infantry assaults. Instead, its forces rely on layered defenses that absorb and slow Russian attacks while exploiting new technology. Swarms of drones conduct near-constant surveillance and strike missions. Long-range strikes reach supply depots, command centers, and logistical nodes deep in Russian-held territory. This not only complicates Moscow's resupply efforts, but steadily wears down the capacity to control occupied regions. Ukraine's approach has ensured that, even without major territorial recovery, Russia cannot hold ground without paying a steadily mounting price. The character of the fighting now reflects positional warfare and attrition rather than swift advances. Losses on both sides remain high. However, casualty estimates vary so widely and remain so contested that no figure can be taken as definitive. In truth, secrecy and propaganda cloud the real human toll, and independent observers caution that the fog of war makes precision nearly impossible. What is clearer is the visible exhaustion. Towns reduced to rubble after repeated clashes, fields scarred by shelling, and civilians caught in the daily routine of bombardments that yield negligible shifts in control. Within this context, Russia has not gained significant new territory in over a year. The stalemate is not accidental. It stems directly from sustained equipment losses, high attrition, and the inability to replace destroyed materiel at the same pace it is expended. Independent research projects monitoring satellite imagery and destroyed equipment catalogs have reinforced this picture, showing why offensive drives that once involved sweeping columns have devolved into small, grinding actions. The limits of Moscow's offensive capacity are now visible not only in strategic outcomes, but in the very way battles are fought. Ukraine, meanwhile, has grown more sophisticated. Its troops have been trained on advanced Western equipment, and logistical coordination with NATO has improved measurably. Compared to 2022, its forces are significantly stronger in terms of training, experience, and adaptability. Russia, relying heavily on mobilized reservists, cycles units in and out of the line after enduring heavy losses. This contrast has not given Ukraine a decisive capability to overwhelm Russian forces, but it has established a hard barrier against further Russian expansion. For Kiev, preventing Moscow from seizing more land is itself an important form of progress. The clashes across the front reveal the substance of this deadlock. Drone strikes destroy frontline positions at night. Ukrainian missiles periodically hit occupied cities such as Melitopol. Russian artillery pounds defensive belts across the contact line nearly every day. Skirmishes erupt in ruined villages and strips of forest, consuming the lives of soldiers without yielding geographic significance. Each clash is a reminder that gains are measured in meters, not miles, and the cost of holding even a small area has become prohibitively high. This impasse is more than just military stalemate. It has political consequences. Wars typically move toward negotiation not only after one side's clear defeat, but also when both recognize that further escalation cannot fundamentally alter the balance. Ukraine has shown it can prevent Russian advances. Russia has shown it can maintain its hold over significant portions of Ukrainian territory. Both, however, face mounting constraints. Moscow can continue expending manpower and hardware, but the hope of advancing beyond the current lines has faded. Kiev has proven it can resist, but the goal of liberation through rapid offensives remains beyond reach for now. It is this paradox, Russian expansion halted, Ukrainian advances constrained, that frames the year ahead. The battlefield of 2025 demonstrates limits rather than breakthroughs, limits on what Russia can achieve given its attrition, and limits on Ukraine's endurance in a prolonged war of resources and lives. Maps that appear static reveal deeper truths: exhaustion of momentum, the ceiling of military capacity, and the growing relevance of political calculation. The deadlock itself has begun to open space for renewed diplomatic considerations, not in theory, but because the battlefield has imposed them as a necessity. As the war approaches this junction, the lines on the map only tell part of the story. Beneath them are towns emptied of their residents, frontline villages reduced to ash, and soldiers locked in daily attrition without decisive reward. This balance of limits is what now pressures both sides, not simply in terms of military planning, but in political endurance. And as the fighting grinds on, the strain is being felt far beyond the trenches, where the war's consequences are measured in lives uprooted, families displaced, and societies struggling with relentless burdens. It is in that dimension that the conflict's true weight is most visible, and it is where the next part of the story unfolds. The human cost no one can ignore. 3 years of war have left tens of thousands dead and driven millions from their homes. Away from the shifting battle maps, the enduring weight falls on ordinary families, parents separated from children, communities scattered across borders, and lives forced into permanent uncertainty. For Ukraine, this has meant entire regions emptied of the familiarity that once held them together. For Europe, it has created one of the largest recent refugee flows on the continent, straining societies in ways that now shape politics as much as military events. When Ukrainians first crossed into Poland in 2022, they were welcomed with solidarity and rapid mobilization of resources. Cities opened schools to new students and neighbors turned apartments into temporary homes. But after 3 years, that generosity runs against practical limits. Polish schools that once made quick adjustments for Ukrainian children now face overcrowded classrooms. Hospitals, long pressured by domestic needs, report long waiting lists. In many neighborhoods, rents have jumped as housing demand outstrips supply. What began as a surge of solidarity has become a prolonged test of capacity, leaving local communities to absorb burdens far beyond what they expected. Germany, further removed from the front, yet hosting vast numbers of Ukrainians, faces a parallel dynamic. Cities such as Berlin and Hamburg now shoulder housing shortages that were already severe before the war. Local councils debate how to balance resources for integration programs against rising frustration from residents who see services stretched thin. The issue has carried into elections, where far-right parties call for limits on arrivals and reductions in support. Even mainstream politicians, while keeping commitments to Ukraine, acknowledge worrying pressure on domestic stability. In practice, Refugee policy is no longer treated as just humanitarian. It is driving debates about the economy, housing, and social cohesion. Inside Ukraine, millions of citizens remain displaced within the country itself. Many fled east and southern combat zones for regions seen as safer, such as Lviv or Dnipro. These host cities, spared from sustained bombardment, now carry populations beyond what their infrastructure was built to handle. Housing shortages overlap with disrupted energy supplies, leaving residents reliant on temporary aid programs that often expire before stability returns. Families forced to move multiple times face lives defined by repetition, settling briefly, enduring new shelling nearby, then uprooting once again. Some displaced Ukrainians have attempted to return home after periods of relative calm. Thousands trying to resettle in places like Kharkiv or Kherson discover the risks immediately. Electricity grids remain fragile, local schools run without reliable heating, and employment is scarce outside informal cash work. Whole families live inside damaged apartment blocks or makeshift shelters provided by aid groups. The presence of unexploded ordnance poses daily dangers, forcing entire neighborhoods to remain unsafe. These attempted returns highlight a painful cycle. Every effort to rebuild can be undone in a single night when shelling starts again. This revolving instability shows why reconstruction projects are so fragile. Even when international partners announce funding or launch rebuilding programs, none of it holds without security. Savings are drained, trust in permanent recovery collapses, and families who return often find themselves displaced once more within months. What policymakers describe as progress feels to many Ukrainians like survival against worsening odds. The reality is that until durable security exists, reconstruction cannot anchor people in their homes. The human toll does not sit in isolation. It reshapes political decision-making. In Poland, policymakers openly link stability in Ukraine with their own domestic pressures, presenting peace as essential to sustaining internal order. Germany faces similar calculations as refugee politics become entangled with broader debates over housing and economic policy. Within Ukraine, leaders must address soldiers at the front alongside citizens displaced at home and abroad, whose patience is finite and whose needs can no longer be postponed. This strain has shifted the debate about the war's future. What was once framed strictly as a moral responsibility to protect innocent civilians and limit human suffering now operates also as a structural necessity for Europe. Millions of displaced individuals are not abstractions. They're tenants seeking housing, patients in hospitals, and workers filling local economies. Their presence exerts pressures that conventional strategies of military support cannot ignore. Politicians in several European capitals face direct electoral consequences if they cannot balance humanitarian commitments with domestic demands. The scale of displacement means a pause in fighting alone will not reverse the crisis. Damaged housing stock, strained hospitals, degraded energy grids, and weak employment opportunities inside Ukraine mean a return for many is not realistic. As long as millions of people remain abroad, political pressure inside host societies will only grow. For European states, this prolongs an unsustainable system in which integration efforts function less as temporary relief and more as permanent adjustment. That is why the humanitarian burden increasingly drives strategic decisions rather than remaining in the background. For months, frontline casualty figures define the rhythm of coverage, but positional warfare has reduced progress into attritional battles with little visible movement. In this space, human displacement has become the defining measure of endurance. Western aid may keep ammunition flowing, but it cannot fully offset the political and social effects of displacing millions. For Ukraine, sustaining widespread exile without clear progress towards stability risks, weakening national unity itself. Peace, then, has acquired a new framing. It is no longer described solely as the right course morally. It is now treated as a requirement to preserve functioning systems in Europe and Ukraine. Overflowing schools, overburdened hospitals, cities unable to absorb new arrivals, and displaced families unable to imagine permanent futures all feed into pressures that leaders can neither ignore nor endlessly defer. Humanitarian consequences are not just side effects of the war. They are political triggers shaping what kinds of agreements become feasible. This makes the humanitarian problem not just a moral issue, but a political engine for peace talks. The upfront costs of displacement and the strain on European societies are altering strategic calculations on all sides. And with the weight of this crisis growing, attention inevitably turns back to those responsible for sustaining the conflict, especially the choices being made in Moscow, and why its original vision for the war has narrowed so dramatically. Russia's shifting strategy. Why has Moscow's war aim narrowed so dramatically over 3 years? Russia began in 2022 with a plan to topple the Ukrainian government outright. By 2025, it has shifted instead to protecting narrower holdings in the east and south, particularly the Donbass and the land corridor linking Crimea to Russia. This change in strategy is not the product of choice, but of limits, military, economic, and political, that reshaped what remained possible after repeated failures. Initial invasion assumed that Ukrainian defenses would collapse quickly and open Kiev to direct control. In reality, frontline losses in the opening months gutted elite Russian formations and exposed planning flaws. Western military aid arrived, Ukraine's leadership stayed put, and Kiev survived the very shock meant to unseat it. With regime change out of reach, Moscow then tried grinding down Ukraine through attrition. The expectation was that sheer manpower and firepower would erode Ukrainian resolve. That too failed, as fortified defenses, Western weapons, and strong mobilization made Ukrainian resistance sustainable. Russia's fallback became clear: hold the Donbass clusters and secure the road and rail links to Crimea. These objectives were recast as essential, even if they represented far less than the sweeping ambitions of 2022. Even that scaled-down approach has required improvisation. Open-source reporting and independent analyses show Russia redeployed older Soviet-era vehicles from storage to replace modern tanks lost in the first years of the war. Footage of outdated armor heading west underscored the depth of equipment attrition. While Russia maintains large stockpiles, advanced vehicles and precision systems remain scarce. Ammunition production has continued, but with limitations, sparking reports of Russia turning abroad to source drones, shells, and missiles. These imports appear in smaller numbers and often with reduced capabilities compared to what was lost. The picture is not total depletion, but it is evidence of sustained strain that forces Moscow to fight differently than it had planned. Manpower has posed a problem of its own. Mobilizations reached beyond the groups originally promised, calling men far older or less fit than expected. Social friction inside Russia has been evident, with families resisting new drafts and regional communities experiencing disproportionate casualties. Independent research points to uneven unit quality and readiness compared to the first wave of soldiers sent in 2022. Russia still commands numbers on paper, but the efficiency of these deployments, combined with low morale and uneven training, limits the credibility of plans for large-scale offensives. This reality shapes the Kremlin's military calculus, a focus on defense, fortifications, and holding what is already taken rather than risking broader advances. Economic pressures amplify these constraints. Energy exports once funded state coffers and foreign policy alike, but the cutoff from European markets forced Russia to redirect sales to Asia at discounted rates. The shift preserved cash flow but eroded overall revenues. Reliance on debt and reserve funds increased, while sanctions narrowed access to industry inputs. Imported consumer goods are scarcer, contributing to inflation and frustration. At the defense level, restrictions on semiconductors and other components hinder the production of modern precision weapons. Russia's domestic factories continue producing shells and drones at volume, but often with less reliability. Smuggling channels have filled some gaps, yet they cannot replicate steady global supply chains. When contrasted with Ukraine's increasing array of Western-supplied systems, the imbalance becomes visible. Energy politics once represented a tool to coerce Europe. By 2025, that leverage is weakened. Diversified suppliers and expanded LNG imports have reshaped the European market. Russia still exports, but with limited influence. For Moscow, this is not only an economic wound, but a loss of diplomatic sway. If leverage involves both battlefield movement and the ability to shape wider strategic outcomes, Russia's narrowed reach marks a profound shift from its former posture. Diplomatically, rhetoric remains maximalist for public audiences, but private signals hint at retrenchment. Moscow tells domestic audiences it cannot yield the Donbass or Crimea, framing these areas as non-negotiable red lines. Yet the language around further expansion has faded. Conversations reported by mediators suggest Moscow's current priority is to secure recognition or de facto acceptance of the lines now held. Talks include themes absent in 2022: ceasefire monitoring, potential international observers, and guarantees meant not to extend its war aims, but to stabilize present control. This scaled-down strategy explains why Russia may now be open to talks that preserve its current holdings rather than gamble on continued expansion. Difference between 2022 and 2025 is stark. 3 years ago, Moscow's primary mode of negotiation was ultimatum, backed by the assumption of military superiority. Today, diplomatic positioning is driven by necessity, not confidence. Russia weighs the cost of further mobilizations, the departure of skilled professionals abroad, and the economic sacrifices sustaining a prolonged campaign. Where once diplomacy appeared irrelevant, it has now become a lever for survival. This recalibration carries risks for Ukraine and its partners. The reduction of Russia's ambitions might appear to lower the threat of a sudden, large-scale offensive against Kiev, but it also increases the chance of a frozen status quo that cements Russia's occupation. Even in a defensive stance, Russian forces can inflict persistent pressure along entrenched front lines. Any settlement favoring consolidation would secure Moscow's gains while forcing Ukraine to accept truncated sovereignty. The logic is not that Russia has won, but that it has managed to avoid outright loss by entrenching inside occupied zones and reframing them as non-negotiable. At the heart of this shift is time. Moscow can sustain stalemate through domestic controls and propaganda, but time also magnifies the internal costs of war. Public frustration with repeated mobilizations, shortages in key goods, and disruptions of the labor force gnaw at the state. The war's strategic shape in 2025 reflects that balance. Not expansion, not decisive defeat, but a stubborn holding pattern justified in rhetoric yet fragile in substance. The irony is sharp. A state that began by demanding submission from Kiev now insists instead on guarantees that it may hold what it already occupies. Those guarantees are what Russian negotiators seek, not the map envisioned in 2022, but the lines wrestled into place through attrition. The strategy has narrowed because the options have narrowed. In place of projected dominance is a fight to safeguard weakened gains. Understanding this Russian adjustment is crucial because it reframes the conversation around what comes next. The choices inside Moscow are no longer about how much can be conquered, but how to hold without collapsing internally. This is why Russia may appear more willing to test negotiated arrangements, provided they secure its remaining foothold. And while Russia recalibrates, the other side of this war faces its own paradox. Ukraine's position is defined by remarkable battlefield resilience, yet its society and economy continue to pay a staggering cost for sustaining that strength. That tension shapes a very different strategic debate, one now beginning to take center stage. Ukraine's balancing act. Ukraine's position in 2025 is defined by what many describe as a difficult balance. On the battlefield, its defenses remain resilient. Russia has not advanced further west in more than a year, and Ukrainian strikes have reached far behind the front. Yet every week of resistance adds to the strain on Ukraine's economy, politics, and society. The state has proven its ability to fight, but sustaining that fight pulls at the very foundations needed to govern daily life. Strength and fragility now coexist, forcing Kiev to manage both at once. Most immediate burden lies in finance. Ukraine's defense depends on steady deliveries of weapons, ammunition, and budgetary assistance from its partners. Tanks, artillery shells, and air defense systems arriving from abroad are not luxuries, they are essential. Every shipment is a reminder of how closely Ukraine's survival is tied to decisions in distant capitals. While allied governments continue to pledge support, debates in Washington, Berlin, and Brussels increasingly complicate long-term planning. Lawmakers ask whether commitments can be sustained for years, and military operations inside Ukraine are shaped by that uncertainty. There has been no collapse in support, but the dependence leaves Kiev vulnerable to outside politics. At home, the economy has absorbed heavy damage. Strategic industrial hubs remain under occupation or at constant risk of strikes, limiting Ukraine's productive output. Grain exports that once powered global markets are reduced, with fields mined or rendered unsafe by artillery fire. Transport networks face continual disruption. Rail lines targeted one month repaired the next, only to be damaged again. Even with billions in international aid offsetting deficits, Ukraine's economic horizon has narrowed. The government works to keep essential services running, hospitals, schools, pensions, but each budget cycle forces new trade-offs between civilian needs and military requirements. Reconstruction adds an extra layer to this challenge. Bridges require rebuilding, housing must be repaired, and critical utilities need restoration after repeated missile strikes. Major cities like Kiev, Odessa, and Kharkiv absorb constant damage that demands immediate response, not postponed solutions after the war. But investing in rebuilding means diverting resources from defense, and defense cannot be neglected without risking further destruction. This dual burden creates a cycle. Rebuild what is destroyed just enough to function, then repeat once attacks resume. National planners find themselves managing two wars at once, the military front and the campaign to keep civilian life minimally stable. The cost of endurance, however, is measured not only in money or infrastructure, but in people. Ukraine's casualty rates remain a sensitive issue. Official casualty counts are limited, and estimates vary widely across independent sources. That lack of clarity complicates political decisions, as leaders must weigh continued mobilization cycles against the exhaustion of communities who already feel the toll. Families face long separations from relatives at the front, while students try to study in schools with unreliable heating and patched windows. Even small businesses operating under bombardment struggle with reduced demand and constant repair costs. Daily life continues, but always under pressure that builds over time. Despite this, public resilience has been extraordinary. Ukrainians have adapted to power cuts, shortages, and dislocation with determination. Yet patience has limits, and fatigue accumulates. After 3 years, questions grow sharper within households. How many more mobilizations are possible, and how many more years of uncertainty can families withstand? Political leaders are aware of this fatigue, and each new policy must address not only the realities of war, but the psychology of a public forced into endurance mode. This makes leadership choices in Kiev particularly complex. On one side, officials repeat firm principles. Ukraine's territorial integrity cannot be compromised, and occupied regions must eventually be returned. That stance reflects both public will and the sacrifices already made. On the other side, leaders know that sustaining the war indefinitely may not be viable. Opportunities to engage in quiet diplomatic channels, once dismissed, now receive more attention. Kiev must juggle maximalist public expectations with limited military and diplomatic options. Crimea provides a clear example. Many citizens insist its return is non-negotiable, but allies often hint at prioritizing security guarantees over immediate territorial changes. Bridging this divide is an ongoing political challenge. The paradox reappears in military strategy. Ukraine has blocked Russian advances, a success that earns international admiration and secures ongoing support. but liberating large swathes of occupied territory remains harder with time. This creates the possibility of a protracted stalemate where Kiev stops Russia from expanding but cannot roll it back at scale. Western backers, aware of this dynamic, may quietly push toward discussions of ceasefires or phased agreements. Even subtle pressure places Ukraine in a delicate position, maintaining principled goals on one hand while managing allied expectations on the other. Dependency on external aid further complicates these calculations. Continued assistance gives Ukraine an edge, but it also creates exposure to shifts in foreign politics. Electoral cycles, competing crises, and budget debates all ripple directly into Kiev's war planning. The challenge is not abrupt abandonment, but a creeping uncertainty that limits long-term strategy. Leaders in Ukraine must therefore calibrate how to reassure both allies and citizens while preparing for scenarios where support fluctuates. Inside the country, definitions of victory remain deeply contested. For some, genuine victory means restoring borders as they stood in 2013. For others, securing viable sovereignty within today's lines, even at the cost of limited compromise, appears acceptable after years of loss. The space between these positions creates tension that could intensify if negotiations move closer. Managing this divergence requires a careful balance of language, avoiding statements that suggest retreat while acknowledging practical limits. Every speech delivered in Kiev is judged for both its domestic and international audience, an ongoing negotiation in itself. This landscape leaves Ukraine's survival depending as much on diplomacy as on military action. Crafting a political settlement, whether soon or distant, means aligning sovereignty, domestic morale, and foreign partnerships at once. Doing so requires defending principles while adapting to constrained realities. It is less about choosing between victory and defeat than about ensuring Ukraine's independence through whichever instruments remain sustainable. The central question becomes whether Kiev can turn defensive resilience into negotiating strength. Success depends on recognizing limits without signaling weakness, and on absorbing pressure for compromise without undermining morale at home. The outcome of this balancing act will define not only the shape of Ukraine's state after the war, but also the stability of Europe's security system. Viewed this way, Ukraine's paradox is not abstract, it is practical. How far can the state stretch without breaking? How much can allies provide without shifting their own priorities? And how can leaders sustain public belief in a war effort that may not deliver immediate resolution? The answers to these questions will frame the next stage of the conflict. So how does Kiev negotiate from strength without losing public support? That is where the involvement of other major powers becomes far more significant than ever before. China's quiet but pivotal role. Why has China become more visible in discussions around Ukraine in 2025? For much of the war, Beijing stood at the margins, calling for dialogue, resisting direct involvement, and maintaining a broadly neutral posture that leaned toward Russia in trade but avoided binding commitments. That pattern has changed. Today, China plays a role significant enough that both Kiev and Moscow quietly gauge its reactions. Its influence is not as a formal mediator appointed to end the war, but as an increasingly influential actor whose economic leverage and global reach shape the context in which talks unfold. This shift follows practical concerns. China's stability still rests on consistent trade flows, efficient supply chains, and reliable energy sources. A prolonged war in Europe disrupts each of these pillars. Grain exports through the Black Sea face recurring interruptions, commodity prices rise with every escalation, and sanctions reshuffle global energy markets in ways that ripple through Beijing's industrial planning. Planners in Chinese ministries measure these shocks in real costs: higher import prices, insurance increases for shipping, and uncertainty for domestic manufacturing. The deeper the instability, the harder it is for Beijing to uphold steady growth. These pressures explain why a stance once confined to rhetoric is giving way to more active engagement. In contrast to the war's early years, Chinese diplomats are now visible in European capitals. Their presence signals not a bid to match Western aid or military backing, but an effort to ensure Beijing's voice is heard as settlement conditions are discussed. What China brings is not artillery or loans, but influence over Moscow. Russia, facing economic isolation, relies heavily on energy exports eastward. China has become one of the largest buyers of discounted Russian oil and gas, a channel Moscow cannot easily replace. That reality gives Beijing a practical lever. It may encourage Russia towards stabilization, even as its leaders avoid appearing like they are taking sides. This is the basis for China's careful balance. Publicly, Beijing echoes criticism of NATO, repeating its standard opposition to Western interventionism. These declarations resonate with Moscow and signal alignment in narrative. Yet privately, Chinese envoys are reported to push Moscow toward considering limited ceasefires or pauses in major offensives. For China, the aim is not moral but pragmatic. Reduce volatility in global markets while maintaining ties with Russia. It is a dual-track approach in which public rhetoric leans toward Moscow's grievances, but diplomatic engagements steer toward conditions that lower economic risk. When Chinese officials outline proposals, they do so cautiously, framing them as plans or ideas for dialogue, rather than binding treaties. The content often involves phased steps, locally monitored ceasefires, guarantees for grain exports, and humanitarian corridors. By keeping the scope confined, Beijing avoids direct entanglement in disputes over borders while presenting itself as constructive. These publicly stated proposals differ from Western frameworks that highlight sovereignty and security commitments. Beijing emphasizes practical outcomes, pauses in fighting, stabilization of trade flows, and pathways to reconstruction talks. To critics, such steps risk locking in Russia's current control. To Beijing, they prevent further disruption of global markets. China's framing finds receptive audiences beyond Europe. For governments in Africa, South America, and parts of Asia, Beijing's language of stability and investment feels more relevant than NATO's emphasis on collective defense. Countries dependent on affordable food and energy supplies see in China's proposals a chance for predictability. The promise of economic engagement, combined with rhetoric connecting peace to long-term development, strengthens Beijing's claim to represent broader global interests. In this way, China positions itself not as a defender of one side, but as a spokesperson for countries hardest hit by the conflict's economic spillovers. Reconstruction features prominently in this positioning. Chinese officials link stabilization to long-term economic incentives, proposing to integrate post-war Ukraine into broader infrastructure networks. These mentions often reference investment in transport corridors, industrial zones, and projects connected to the Belt and Road framework. While far from confirmed deals, they serve as visible incentives. China signals it is willing to frame peace not simply as stopping violence, but as opening paths to development. This contrasts with Western pledges, which often arrive as slower-moving aid packages tied to complex political conditions. For Beijing, hints of investment expand its influence, indicate credibility, and reinforce the message that it can deliver tangible benefits where others hesitate. Moscow faces obvious tension in this arrangement. Chinese involvement, while helpful in promoting dialogue, underscores Russia's growing dependence. Energy prices are often negotiated to Beijing's advantage. Technology imports flow eastward more than westward, and Russia accepts terms that it would have resisted before 2022. Aligning with China helps maintain its war effort, but it also signals a junior partnership. The Kremlin has gained trade flows, but lost pricing power and geopolitical independence in key sectors. Nonetheless, Moscow accepts the trade-off, recognizing that without China's purchases or its resistance to Western sanctions, Russia's isolation would be far deeper. Kiev views China differently. Ukrainian officials remain wary, noting Beijing has avoided condemning the invasion and continues significant trade with Russia. Yet the recognition is clear. Any degree of leverage over Moscow cannot be dismissed. Ukraine does not treat China as a partner, but as a pressure channel, an external actor capable of conveying messages in ways Western capitals cannot. Even when specific Chinese initiatives seem too vague or too favorable to Russia, the prospect of involving Beijing is considered useful, if only to widen the arena of diplomacy. China's role is therefore neither that of decisive peace broker nor passive bystander. It is something in between, an important global actor aligning with its own priorities, which happen to intersect with the need for de-escalation. By connecting peace initiatives to market stability, reconstruction promises, and trade corridors, Beijing frames its involvement as pragmatic rather than ideological. That positioning allows it to influence Moscow without provoking full-scale backlash from Western capitals or alienating parts of the global South. This makes China one of the few actors with leverage over Russia at a critical point. Its influence stems from a specific dependency, Russia's need for its market, not from overwhelming dominance. By combining that lever with economic incentives and neutral language, Beijing has positioned itself as difficult to exclude in any discussion of war or peace. The more the battlefield settles into stalemate, the more that external economic actors like China acquire space to shape outcomes. Its strategy thrives in paralysis, not because it resolves disputes directly, but because it can manage the risks others cannot accept indefinitely. The broader consequence is that the war now unfolds not only across trenches or through Western alliances, but through global economic networks, where China's presence is constant. Every step Beijing takes alters the diplomatic environment, sometimes by slowing escalation, sometimes by framing conditions for talks others would not advance. China does not have the authority to dictate end states, but its refusal to remain only an observer means that settlements, however temporary, are increasingly discussed with its role in view. This development matters because it reshapes the dynamic from one dominated exclusively by the Euro-Atlantic alliance. A non-Western power applying real influence creates a more multipolar environment for managing the conflict, one where energy trade, commodity stability, and investment flows become as decisive as troop movements. That shift prepares the ground for debates not only about how the war ends, but also about what new security arrangements emerge around it. And as Beijing finds space in European discussions, questions arise about the other pole of power in the conflict, the alliance that has expanded, rearmed, and signaled readiness for permanent deployments. Those choices are reshaping Europe's security order in ways unseen for decades, with direct consequences for how Russia and its neighbors navigate the years ahead. NATO expansion and European security redefined. NATO's evolution since 2022 has created a security order in Europe that looks entirely different from what existed before. What was once seen as a cautious alliance content with reassurance is now openly building a hardened posture on its eastern flank. This shift is driven by enlargement, reinforced infrastructure, and adjusted doctrine, factors that together have redrawn the continent's defense perimeter in ways that Russia did not anticipate. The most visible change came with Finland and Sweden's accession. Their move into NATO closed long-standing gaps and sent a message that neutrality was no longer a shield. Finland added hundreds of miles of direct border with Russia into NATO's framework, creating a continuous northern front shaped by forests, lakes, and fortified outposts. Sweden's entry, meanwhile, gave the alliance decisive influence over the Baltic Sea. Maritime routes critical for moving reinforcements are now under a strengthened umbrella. Together, these accessions knit Scandinavia into NATO's deterrent structure and shifted the balance from pockets of vulnerability to a contiguous arc of protection. Alongside enlargement came forward basing. Poland has become central to this updated posture, hosting logistics hubs, air defense systems, and troop rotations that are evolving into semi-permanent presences. Romania has followed suit, expanding facilities near the Black Sea that extend surveillance and naval coordination. This is not a sudden surge of troops, but the entrenchment of infrastructure designed to endure, hardened depots, command centers, and layered defenses. NATO has deliberately moved from temporary reassurance to a model of long-term deterrence, one that reflects the view that Russian pressure is not an episode, but a condition. The consequence is strategic redefinition. NATO planners now design defense with the assumption that containment is permanent. Air defense networks stretch across Scandinavia, Central Europe, and the Black Sea, leaving fewer gaps than ever. Joint exercises test mobility and coordination in real-world scenarios rather than symbolic drills. Budgets allocate resources for durable installations rather than rotating visits. Once, deterrence depended on political statements and the promise of reinforcement. Today, it is material, embedded, and visible on the ground. For Moscow, this outcome cuts directly against its narrative. Russia justified the invasion of Ukraine on the grounds that NATO enlargement endangered its security. But the war has brought the opposite result. Instead of stopping expansion, Moscow accelerated it. Instead of pushing NATO back, it faces reinforced defenses at its borders. Russian officials speak in escalating tones, warning of proportional responses or unspecified measures, but their conventional military options are stretched thin. With large parts of their equipment tied down in Ukraine, high casualty rates continuing, and mobilization politically costly, Russia lacks the capacity to confront NATO's perimeter directly. Nuclear forces remain the one arena where Moscow retains parity and deterrence, which underscores both the limits of its conventional reach and the risks of miscalculation. This gap between rhetoric and reality has become clear. Russian broadcasts claim encirclement, portraying NATO's actions as hostile and illegitimate. Yet beyond disinformation campaigns, cyber operations, or small-scale troop movements along borders, Moscow's practical tools are limited. The infrastructure NATO has placed in Poland and Romania, the protections extended through Finland and Sweden, and the integration of command structures are not easily reversed. They represent a bond between political will and military posture that cannot be unwound, even if hostilities in Ukraine were to pause. For Europe, the implications are lasting. NATO is no longer structured as a flexible force that can contract and expand. It is embedded along its eastern and northern rim. Governments have committed to higher defense spending, structured procurement pipelines, and basing agreements that lock the alliance into a posture of vigilance. In Poland and the Baltics, populations perceive this as overdue recognition of their warnings about Russia. In Scandinavia, the sense of insulation has been replaced by integration. Across the continent, reassurance now comes less from diplomacy and more from infrastructure designed to deter by its very existence. Diplomatic consequences flow from this entrenchment. Any negotiation Russia attempts will take place with these realities in the background. NATO is stronger, larger, and more deeply positioned. Moscow knows this shifts its leverage downward, forcing any settlement discussion into an environment where concessions are more visible. Refusing compromise consumes resources and time. Accepting it risks acknowledging the permanence of NATO's gains. Either choice reflects a strategic loss compared to Moscow's original aims. For NATO, unity has been reinforced. The eastern flank feels protected, and northern members see their interests fully integrated. But maintaining this posture requires costs, sustained funding, industrial capacity to supply the alliance, and political agreement within societies managing inflation and reconstruction contributions. Rotational forces and permanent bases carry ongoing price tags. If anything, the real test ahead is whether European states can hold public support for policies that assume permanent confrontation rather than temporary emergency. The payoff, however, is a perimeter stronger than at any time in recent history. The combination of enlargement, entrenched defenses, and integrated exercises means Europe now has fewer seams to exploit. What this means for Ukraine is immediate, a stronger outer wall that constrains Russia's options. But it also means the diplomatic environment is less forgiving for Moscow. Force alone cannot change the outcome in its favor. Russia faces not a divided Europe open to compromise, but a coherent alliance positioned to resist indefinitely. this redefinition of security sets the backdrop for another dimension of the conflict: economic pressure. Military lines are hardened, but the question of endurance extends beyond the battlefield and bases. After years of sanctions and redirected trade, both Russia and Europe have absorbed shocks that continue to shape strategy. With conventional parity eroding, the struggle increasingly turns to economics to determine who can sustain the war longer. That is where the costs and consequences of isolation become harder to measure, yet impossible to ignore. Sanctions and the war economy. After 3 years of sanctions, the focus has shifted to a different kind of battleground: the war economy. The central question is not simply whether Europe or Russia won the sanctions fight, but how each side has absorbed the shock and what long-term weaknesses have emerged. At first, both expected the other to collapse. European capitals braced for an energy crunch that might cripple industries, while Moscow predicted Europe could not survive without Russian gas. Neither of these forecasts turned out as imagined. Instead, both endured disruption, but in very different ways. Europe accepted painful short-term adjustments and began to rebuild resilience, while Russia devised improvised workarounds that sustained revenues at the cost of deeper structural compromises. For Moscow, survival has meant constructing parallel systems outside official markets. One of the most visible examples has been the use of what analysts call shadow shipping: tankers switching off tracking systems, registered under obscure flags, and carrying sanctioned oil to buyers willing to defy Western restrictions. Documented trade workarounds like these allowed discounted Russian crude to continue flowing to destinations such as Turkey, India, and especially China. These deliveries kept cash coming into Russia's budget, though not at the levels once enjoyed. Discounts below benchmark prices eroded revenue, and the logistics chains that sustain the trade are fragile. Shadow shipping is not stability, it is improvisation, dependent on hidden systems vulnerable to accidents, seizures, or shifts in insurance rules. Redirecting pipelines has been another pillar of adaptation. Once Europe cut back on Russian oil and gas purchases, Moscow looked east. China and India emerged as its key customers. The volumes redirected were large enough to maintain output, but the trade-off was loss of control. These buyers leveraged Russia's limited options to demand significant discounts. Russian officials can note barrels still move in bulk, but the prices no longer reflect Moscow's preferences. Combined with the investments required to expand new pipelines and build additional terminal capacity, profit margins have stretched thin. The result is a paradox. Exports persist, but with shrinking leverage and declining returns. A parallel system of imports emerged in response to Western restrictions. Consumer goods banned under sanctions often reappear through neighbors acting as intermediaries. Central Asian trade firms, for example, have become conduits for electronics, textiles, and vehicle parts entering Russia after multiple handoffs. This grey imports system supplies markets in Russian cities, but at higher costs. Inflation and shortages have become embedded in daily life. A household might still buy a television or refrigerator, but the choice is narrower, the price higher, and the quality reduced compared to what was available before 2022. Meanwhile, major sectors face more acute constraints. Civil aviation has been forced to keep aging planes operational without steady supplies of spare parts. Factories can substitute some industrial equipment, but often with inferior replacements. The appearance of normal supply hides a deeper erosion of quality and capacity. For Europe, the experience unfolded differently. The shock hit hardest in 2022 and 2023 as energy prices spiked and governments feared rationing gas. Families saw utility bills soar, and industries dependent on cheap natural gas, chemicals, fertilizers, steel, faced shutdown risks. Street protests broke out, and political factions used the crisis to attack ruling coalitions. But adaptation followed. Europe accelerated energy diversification at unprecedented speed. Liquefied natural gas imports rose sharply, with infrastructure expanding as Germany, Poland, and other states built terminals on tight deadlines. Long-term supply contracts were signed with the US, Qatar, and North Africa. Renewables, already on the rise, expanded faster as leaders pushed to reduce imports from Russia permanently. By 2025, many European states pay energy prices closer to pre-war norms, and what began as a vulnerability has become a structural shift. Moscow's leverage over Europe through energy is essentially gone. This rebalancing came with costs. Subsidies drained national budgets. Governments shielded households and industries from the worst bills at billions in expense, while inflation drove political frustration. Still, the pain was temporary. Recovery fed resilience, leaving Europe tied less to Russian gas and more to diverse suppliers worldwide. Strategically, this was transformative. Energy independence from Moscow is no longer a future ambition, but a baseline. The decision-making calculus in European capitals now assumes permanent disengagement from Russian suppliers. What once seemed a weak point in European security turned into a pressured but successful reconfiguration of energy policy. The strongest effects of sanctions emerged in Russia's defense industry. Unlike consumer goods, high-tech components for weapons cannot be as easily rerouted through third parties. Western export controls on semiconductors and precision components have degraded Russia's ability to mass-produce advanced weapons, forcing improvisation. Modern drones require specialized chips, optics, and sensors not easily reproduced domestically. Precision missiles rely on imported parts that cannot be manufactured at scale within Russia's current industrial base. The consequences appear in battlefield equipment. Improvised drones built from commercial parts, cruise missiles with diminished accuracy, older tanks refurbished as substitutes. Russia prioritizes quantity over quality, but the technological gap with Western-supplied Ukrainian systems continues to grow each year. Sanctions were never intended as a single decisive blow. Instead, they function as a prolonged attrition mechanism. Russia has demonstrated resilience by maintaining exports and substituting imports, but at high cost. Energy sales no longer generate surpluses. They only stabilize fragile budgets. Parallel logistics systems keep goods flowing, but inflation and declining quality define the results. Meanwhile, Europe, after initial hardship, has adjusted. Its economies are again on a growth trajectory, supported by a more diverse energy mix and momentum toward green technology investment. This contrast reflects the essential asymmetry. Europe bore pain to restructure, while Russia exhausts itself to maintain survival. By 2025, this picture translates into a tilted balance. Russia continues to sell oil and gas, but without pricing power. It maintains weapons production, but shortages of advanced components hollow out reliability. Its consumer markets function, but only through higher prices and restricted choice. Europe, meanwhile, emerges more independent, with a structural break from Russian suppliers that was unimaginable before the war. Sanctions have not ended the conflict, but they have reshaped the war economy's trajectory. The broader conclusion is clear. Europe absorbed short-term pain, but structurally reduced dependence. Russia preserved export volumes, but lost pricing power and high-tech capacity. This dynamic ensures that the economic dimension of the conflict remains as important as the battles at the front. And while sanctions carve at Moscow's endurance, their ripple effects extend far beyond Europe and Russia. Those secondary effects now reach global markets, shaking industries and shifting political alignments on every continent. Energy trade no longer flows along the same routes it once did, and the governments tasked with securing those supplies are recalculating their policies in ways that could define the next decade. The global energy shockwave. The war's most persistent ripple has not come from shifting front lines, but from the disruption of global energy flows. What began as a European crisis has become a worldwide reordering of how nations secure, price, and consume energy. 3 years after the invasion, this global energy shockwave has remade the supply map and heightened the link between national security and energy dependence. The first impact came when Europe suddenly lost access to its primary source of natural gas. For decades, pipelines stretching from Siberia under the Baltic and across Ukraine delivered steady volumes at relatively low cost. In 2022, those flows collapsed. Governments, industries, and households confronted surging bills and the fear of shortages. Steel and fertilizer plants braced for shutdowns, families rationed heating, and whole economies adjusted to the prospect of scarcity. Yet within 2 years, that crisis produced a dramatic pivot. Europe accelerated the construction of liquefied natural gas terminals, particularly in Germany, the Netherlands, and southern hubs. Contracts were secured with suppliers from the United States, Qatar, and North Africa. Imports that once trickled in as a supplement became the foundation of Europe's gas security. This emergency restructuring reshaped global LNG markets. Cargoes bound for Europe redirected shipping traders away from Asia, often at the last minute. Importers like Japan and South Korea suddenly found themselves competing with European buyers, pushing up costs. Smaller economies in Southeast Asia faced even sharper strain as bids trailed behind larger markets. The surge in LNG demand created widespread price pressure, raising electricity generation costs and feeding into manufacturing inflation across Asia. Independent analyses also point to knock-on consequences for developing nations in Africa and Latin America, where reliance on imported fuels made higher energy bills a central political issue. The Ukrainian war may have been distant, but the pressure it created landed in households thousands of miles from the battlefield. As Europe rushed to secure LNG, Russia was forced into its own redirection. The crude exports that once flowed west instead moved east toward China and India. Both seized the opportunity to buy at steep discounts, not as one-off deals, but as a sustained structure of trade. Moscow maintained export volumes, but forfeited pricing power. Analysts note this dependence locks Moscow into terms that reflect its weakened bargaining position. The same story applies to natural gas, though infrastructure lags. While Russia expands pipelines to China, deliveries remain limited by geography and build-out timelines. What is clear is that Russia's pre-war role as Europe's dominant supplier has been dramatically reduced, and Europe no longer depends on Russian pipeline gas the way it did before 2022. China's position illustrates how the shockwave altered relative strength. By absorbing discounted Russian energy, Beijing underwrote elements of Moscow's budget while fueling its own industries at favorable cost. Some of this crude was refined into petroleum products and exported anew, allowing China to gain market share in refined fuels. The arrangement maintains Russia's economy in the short term, but leaves it in a subordinate role. Reliant on demand it cannot easily replace, tied to contracts set on terms favorable to Chinese buyers. India, too, benefits from this asymmetry, increasing volumes of Russian crude it previously bought only in small quantities. The broader pattern is fragmentation. Before 2022, energy flowed through relatively coherent global markets, pricing shaped by supply and demand dynamics across continents. Since 2022, those flows have been reordered into clusters of politically aligned suppliers and buyers. Europe tightened bonds with the US, Norway, Qatar, and North Africa, creating both energy security arrangements and diplomatic ties that extend beyond fuel. Russia now brackets itself with China and informally with Iran, states willing to accept sanctioned trade structures so long as discounts ensure profit. India navigates between these spaces, extracting benefits from Russia while keeping strong connections to Western markets. The war disrupted globalization's predictable energy map and replaced it with a more fractured pattern where politics set terms as much as markets. These adjustments had strategic consequences beyond supply. Russia's long-used tactic of threatening Europe with withheld gas is no longer viable. European leaders negotiate without the same fear of coercion, yet the shock introduced new vulnerabilities elsewhere. Import costs destabilized government budgets across developing countries, driving up subsidies and altering domestic politics. In Africa, high LNG bills intersected with rising grain costs to fuel unrest. In Latin America, higher fuels strained economies already pressured by inflation. These effects show why the war produced not only a European security crisis, but a global economic one. At the same time, the crisis accelerated a pivot that might have otherwise taken decades. Renewable energy expansion, already part of Europe's long-term planning, advanced with new urgency. Programs for solar and wind gained funding increases, hydrogen pilots were doubled, and nuclear returned to policy debate in states once hesitant to embrace it. Energy independence was redefined to include renewables as protection from geopolitical risk. This structural change ensures that even in the event of a ceasefire, Europe does not revert to dependence on Russian gas. The infrastructure and political momentum now flow firmly in another direction. The uneven distribution of benefits and losses is striking. Russia continues to sell energy, but on terms dictated elsewhere, its fiscal survival tied to fragile discounts and shadow transport fleets that avoid sanctions. Europe endured painful years of inflation and subsidy costs, but emerged more structurally resilient, with diversified suppliers and accelerated transition to green energy. Asian buyers now operate in a more competitive LNG market, with Japan and South Korea shouldering higher bills and smaller economies struggling to compete. North African and Middle Eastern producers, meanwhile, exploited their new position, gaining leverage with Europe as indispensable suppliers. Perhaps the most important outcome is the permanent embedding of energy into geopolitical strategy. Questions of sovereignty and security no longer exist apart from questions of energy supply. Ports, terminals, and shipping networks that were once technical infrastructure now function as strategic front lines. Policy debates about climate and decarbonization are no longer just environmental, they are cast as measures of independence. Energy realignment may be the most enduring strategic effect of the war. Military maps can shift, negotiations can redefine borders, but the disruption to oil, gas, and renewables has already set the foundations of a new international economy. The way governments now plan their energy future has been altered irreversibly by the war's shock. And while these flows determine global patterns, the war's most profound test lies closer to the battlefield. Even as artillery still strikes Ukrainian cities, questions of how to rebuild entire towns, industries, and communities are already shaping political debate. The next challenge is no longer just how to fight, but how to reconstruct what has been lost. The question of reconstruction. Even as the war drags on, Ukrainian officials and communities have begun working through the enormous question of reconstruction. Planning is already underway for what comes next, and the scale being discussed by experts and policymakers is vast. Estimates range into the hundreds of billions of dollars and beyond, stretching across multiple decades. Calculations do not stop at repairing homes or public buildings. They include energy networks, major industrial hubs, farmland cleared of mines, bridges rebuilt after repeated destruction, and the long-term rehabilitation of schools and hospitals. The picture is less about a rapid rebuild once the fighting ends, and more about sustained cycles of investment that will span generations. International partners have responded with commitments, though the gap between pledges and delivery is clear. The European Union, the World Bank, the United States, and other allies have all issued frameworks promising tens of billions in aid, loans, or technical support. Private companies and investors have shown interest in sectors ranging from renewable energy to telecommunications. Yet the reality is that most of this money has not become bricks, mortar, or functioning grids. Pledges exist, but disbursement lags. Bureaucracies and risk assessments bog down the process, and investors hesitate to commit in environments where strikes could undo their projects overnight. This mismatch between headline promises and operational delivery explains why on-the-ground change remains limited despite announcements of historic-scale support. The dilemma Ukrainian leaders face is straightforward but brutal, whether to rebuild under active fire or hold off until stability emerges. Citizens cannot wait indefinitely. Families returning to damaged towns demand heating, repaired power lines, and functioning schools now. Delays consign them to years in temporary shelters or under tarpaulins. But allocating millions to projects in regions where shelling continues risks seeing the same facilities destroyed almost at once. In Kherson, Zaporizhia, and near Kharkiv, repair crews restore water systems and electricity grids only to repeat the same work weeks later. Each cycle drains not just funding, but morale. Over time, the question arises: how many times should the same bridges, power stations, or clinics be rebuilt before resources shift elsewhere? These competing realities shape an argument with no easy resolution. Donors also weigh this trade-off. While they see reconstruction as a humanitarian necessity, they also use future assistance as leverage in high-level politics. Western governments routinely signal that large-scale funding can only flow once a durable form of stability is in place. Ukrainian leaders, in turn, highlight the dependence on this assistance, both as a means to encourage support and as a reminder to populations that outside help will not arrive without conditions. Russia, though excluded from most rebuilding frameworks, tacitly acknowledges the power of this dynamic by repeatedly asserting that occupied territories will require rehabilitation under its administration. The constant talk of future reconstruction has therefore become part of the bargaining space around negotiations, less a matter of bricks than of strategy. Meanwhile, life in many Ukrainian cities illustrates the urgency. Schools in damaged districts operate out of modular buildings or temporary shelters. Community associations organize heating distribution because central facilities remain too fragile. Roads repaired last month break apart again after missile impacts. Commuters pass daily along streets scattered with debris. These signs make reconstruction feel less like a grand future project and more like small measures of survival threaded into everyday life. For civilians, the argument about long-term strategies collides with the immediate need for livable conditions. For international donors, seeing visible scars reinforces the legitimacy of Ukraine's requests, even as they question exactly how to allocate funds in situations where permanence cannot be guaranteed. At the national level, officials in Kiev must juggle priorities. They face urgent pressure to restore power systems, bridges, and hospitals, but also to design long-term frameworks that will make eventual recovery sustainable. Should energy grids be patched repeatedly, even at risk of being targeted again, or should funds be shifted towards safer Western regions that can serve as stable growth centers? Should resources go first to industries that might drive future export earnings, or to immediate housing for displaced citizens? Every choice has a political implication, in terms of morale, in terms of economic activity, and in terms of showing international partners that money can be used effectively. Private companies and investors have begun exploring opportunities, but always cautiously. Telecommunications firms, renewable energy developers, and construction contractors show interest on paper, but actual projects remain rare without strong security guarantees. Insurance costs for operations inside Ukraine remain prohibitively high, and lenders demand protections against renewed destruction. This means many contracts remain suspended in talks or pilot phases well short of the scale required. Investors articulate readiness, but the absence of predictability prevents decisive movement. What external firms can supply so far is limited to specialist systems or technology windows, rarely the major infrastructure projects Ukraine needs. What has emerged instead is a landscape of smaller, improvised reconstruction led by Ukrainians themselves. Community groups patch roofs, replace windows in damaged apartments, build prefabricated classrooms, and restore electricity in villages bypassed by large-scale aid. Volunteer networks often coordinate through social media, pooling donations to restore housing block by block. Innovative startups supply modular building materials or low-cost repair kits. These decentralized efforts cannot replace national reconstruction, but they represent resilience in action. By ensuring towns remain inhabitable, even under constant risk, they prevent permanent depopulation of affected regions. Every restored water pipe, replacement window, or reopened classroom has meaning beyond its scale. It asserts local determination in the face of chronic disruption. Planners know that reconstruction is now about more than material rebuilding. It functions as currency in diplomacy. Each donor's pledge is not only humanitarian but strategic. used in talks to show commitment or to demand concessions. Kiev uses the idea of large rebuilding packages to reinforce its long-term legitimacy. Western governments portray infrastructure commitments as evidence that peace will be rewarded. Even Russia acknowledges this emphasis by contesting the narrative of who will ultimately fund and administer restoration in occupied zones. Reconstruction funding and credibility have become bargaining tools linked directly to ceasefire conditions. The result is a paradox that mirrors Ukraine's wider position. Reconstruction is both a humanitarian imperative and a strategic mechanism. It must serve the immediate need for livable conditions while also existing as leverage in negotiations that may shape the eventual terms of peace. For Ukrainian civilians, the question is survival and dignity. For leaders in Kiev, Brussels, and Washington, it is also about signaling long-term partnership and commitment. This duality ensures that reconstruction remains at the center of political dialogue, even before the war is resolved. What no planner believes, however, is that there will be a single comprehensive moment when rebuilding begins in full. Talk of timelines is misleading. No clear date can trigger reconstruction at scale so long as sections of the country face constant bombardment. Instead, experts describe rolling phases, piecemeal restoration during war, more concentrated infrastructure projects if stability emerges, and then decades-long development plans. Seeing reconstruction this way explains why it is already embedded into diplomatic negotiations. It is not a future promise detached from current realities, but a process whose shape will depend directly on whatever settlement conditions are established. In every respect, reconstruction remains a decisive factor, not because it promises rapid transformation, but because it embodies trade-offs. How resources will be allocated, how major powers will commit, and how political deals will be framed. For Ukrainian civilians, its meaning rests in immediate survival. For negotiators, its weight lies in shaping bargaining dynamics. And as those negotiations edge closer to the forefront, reconstruction stands alongside territory, sovereignty, and security guarantees as one of the central conditions around which the war's eventual resolution will turn. What a resolution could look like. As discussions continue in 2025, the central question is not whether the war can produce an outright winner, but what sort of resolution is politically and militarily possible. Each proposal for ending or pausing the conflict comes with trade-offs. None promises triumph. All attempt to carve out stability from limits already visible on the battlefield and in diplomatic negotiations. Three frameworks dominate: a freeze of current lines, a land-for-peace bargain, or a formal ceasefire with international guarantees. The first option is a freeze at the current front lines. Pro, it halts fighting, enabling reconstruction and a measure of civilian return. Con, Russia retains its occupied territory without formal recognition, leaving disputed areas unresolved and Ukraine divided indefinitely. In this scenario, international observers could be stationed in buffer zones to reduce flare-ups, but sovereignty questions remain unsettled. The arrangement provides survival rather than closure. A second possibility is a land-for-peace arrangement. Pro, Russia gains consolidation over areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, or Crimea, pitched domestically as a victory. Ukraine would receive binding external guarantees, possibly tied to new security commitments. Con, any concession of territory is politically toxic in Kiev. Constitutional provisions forbid ceding land, and public opposition remains overwhelming. For Ukraine's leaders, agreeing to such a deal risks internal instability as much as foreign vulnerability. This design stabilizes in theory, but undermines legitimacy at home. It is often cited by diplomats, but remains extremely difficult for Ukrainian politicians to accept without facing collapse domestically. The third outline is a comprehensive ceasefire treaty with strong external enforcement. Pro, Ukraine avoids formal loss of territory and secures international guarantees, potentially through NATO or EU-linked commitments. Russia could use compliance to lift parts of its sanctions burden and reintegrate into trade networks. Con. Moscow resists any terms strengthening Ukraine's Western alignment, while Kiev insists that Crimea cannot be excluded from final arrangements. Both sides remain far apart on fundamentals. Ukraine has also insisted on a ceasefire before entering serious negotiations, a stance that limits movement when Moscow demands talks without preconditions. In principle, this is the most stable blueprint, but the obstacles to achieving it are high. For military enthusiasts, the key is, none of these outcomes arises from a decisive offensive. They emerge instead because both Russia and Ukraine have hit practical limits. Russia cannot advance deeper without unsustainable losses, and Ukraine cannot forcibly reclaim all territory despite resilience. This explains why conversations focus on imperfect settlements over visions of clear victory. Sovereignty and legitimacy shape the boundary of these negotiations. Ukraine's leaders argue that sovereignty extends beyond borders to national dignity. Compromises that suggest sacrifices or in vain threaten public trust. Russia, conversely, craves symbols of legitimacy to present at home. Any retreat without holding ground undermines the narrative that frames the war as existential. Each side faces audiences unwilling to accept what appears as capitulation, narrowing room for maneuver. Pressure from outside actors complicates decisions further. Western governments sustain assistance but face their own resource fatigue. In the US and Europe, budget debates highlight frustration with indefinite commitments. Polling shows voters wary of endless funding cycles, even among populations supportive of Ukraine. As patience thins, quiet pressure builds for a settlement. At the same time, Kiev signals it will not compromise on Crimea, status it presents as fundamental to national integrity. That clash between Western pragmatism and Ukrainian principle blocks many proposals from moving forward. Each model also carries the risk of storing instability. Frozen conflicts often collapse into renewed fighting in later years as rival states regroup. Land for peace deals may sow anger that radicalizes politics and widens nationalist opposition. Even carefully structured ceasefires remain vulnerable if one guarantor weakens its commitment or if enforcement mechanisms erode. Diplomats understand peace that rests heavily on exhaustion can falter when conditions shift. The open question is whether international institutions can maintain sufficient oversight to prevent these fragile settlements from unraveling. Still, full-scale victory is not on the table. Ukraine cannot feasibly evict Russia from every occupied village by force alone, not without accepting years of grueling attritional war. Moscow, meanwhile, cannot impose regime change or dominate Ukraine militarily. The failures of 2022 and subsequent stalemate demonstrate the limits of its capability. Both sides confront boundaries not of will, but of capacity. This shared reality drives negotiators to consider settlements previously dismissed. Among policymakers, the most widely discussed forecast is some version of a frozen or semi-frozen arrangement. This does not suggest celebration or reconciliation. It signals a pause structured by exhaustion and brokered through external guarantees to prevent resumption of violence. International monitors could oversee ceasefire zones, and sanctions might unlock step by step based on compliance. Such a deal does not settle sovereignty disputes, and it leaves many communities under de facto occupation, but it prevents continual escalation. For Ukraine, this would mean space for reconstruction and international funding. For Russia, it allows claims of success by holding territory, however limited. What such outcomes reveal is equilibrium shaped by necessity. Ukraine seeks survival as an independent state and legitimacy for sacrifices already endured. Russia seeks to justify losses with tangible rewards it can present to its citizens. Neither state secures total victory. Both seek arrangements that provide enough of a story to preserve political stability at home. That parity of limitation, rather than parity of power, defines prospects for settlement. A resolution along these lines is less about grand diplomacy and more about managing exhaustion. The war's trajectory points away from breakthroughs and toward concessions tethered by outside oversight. The durability of any deal will depend directly on whether international actors maintain engagement long after media attention fades. Without enforcement, even a frozen conflict risks thawing into renewed cycles of war. A frozen or semi-frozen settlement is currently the most probable outcome. It is fragile, leaving grievances unresolved and borders in dispute, yet it could hold if backed by consistent outside enforcement. That fragility is the condition shaping diplomacy at the moment. What follows will not be peace secured through decisive conquest, but the attempt to stabilize after shared exhaustion. And that outcome carries consequences far beyond Ukraine's borders. This is where the conversation turns to the wider implications. How such a resolution shapes Europe's security order, and how the global balance adapts to an uneasy end rather than a clear victory, will determine whether this war's close marks peace or only pause. Peace in Ukraine may be closer now not because one side claimed victory, but because limits have finally been reached. Troop losses, economic strain, and political fatigue have forced every actor to confront hard boundaries. Three factors will shape what comes next: a military stalemate that neither side can break, mounting diplomatic pressure from energy disruption, refugee displacement, and China's influence, and the redefined security architecture of NATO and Europe after expansion and entrenchment. If you want a deeper analysis of which resolution scenario benefits which weapon systems and force postures, comment below. How the war ends will define Europe's security for a generation, and that's what we'll be watching in 2025.